I want to tell you about a Tuesday evening, rain coming down sideways, and a man I found lying half on the curb outside a pharmacy on Delacroix Street, because that's where this whole thing starts, and because I've come to believe you can't understand anything that happened after without understanding exactly how ordinary that moment felt while it was happening. My name is Noelle Ferris. I was 29 that year, working as a physical therapist at a clinic 3 blocks from my apartment, the kind of job where you spend your days with your hands on other people's pain, trying to coax bodies back into remembering how to move the way they used to. I mention that only because it matters later, because what I did that Tuesday wasn't some act of sudden, uncharacteristic heroism. It was, in a real sense, just my job, done on a sidewalk instead of in a treatment room, for someone who hadn't asked for it and couldn't have paid me for it even if he'd wanted to. I should start with how it began, because the order matters. I'd just left the pharmacy with a bag of nothing important, cough syrup, a heating pad, the small unglamorous errands that fill up an ordinary evening, when I saw him. A man, maybe somewhere in his 60s, down on one knee on the wet pavement with his other leg splayed out at an angle that made my stomach turn before my brain had even finished processing what I was looking at. He wasn't shouting. That was the first strange thing about it. Looking back, a man in that much pain, and he wasn't making a sound, just breathing hard through his teeth and trying, uselessly, to push himself back up with hands that were shaking too badly to hold his weight. People were walking past him. I want to say that plainly, without judgment, because I understand why rain, evening rush, a city full of people hurrying home with their heads down. But I'd spent 6 years training myself to see exactly this kind of moment, to read a body in distress the way other people read a sentence, and I didn't think twice. I just crossed the sidewalk and knelt down next to him in the wet. "Don't try to stand," I said. "Let me look first." He turned his head and looked at me, sharp eyes, even through the pain, taking my measure in about a second and a half, and said, in a voice that was tight but oddly composed, "I appreciate the instinct, but I don't need." "You do," I said. "Your ankle's already swelling through your sock, and if that's a fracture and you put weight on it, you'll make it worse. I'm a physical therapist. Let me actually look." He stopped arguing. I think, in hindsight, that surprised him more than anything else that happened that night, that a stranger had simply overridden his objection and he'd found, somewhat to his own confusion, that he didn't mind. His name, he told me while I was checking his ankle for the telltale give of a break, was Bartholomew Ashcombe, though he said it like a man giving a name that had been useful to him for a long time without ever quite fitting, the way an old coat fits, serviceable, unremarkable, chosen more for practicality than truth. He'd been walking to a dinner, he said, misjudged a curb in the rain, and gone down hard enough to wrench the joint badly, though as far as I could tell in the fading light it wasn't broken, a bad sprain, possibly a hairline fracture, nothing that wouldn't heal with rest and the right care, but nothing he should be walking on either. "You should get this looked at properly tonight," I told him, helping him to a sitting position against the pharmacy's brick wall. "An X-ray, at minimum. Do you have someone I can call?" "I have a car coming," he said. It was already coming. I only need to wait. "In the rain? On a bad ankle?" He gave me a look that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being fussed over, and I gave him a look right back that suggested I didn't particularly care whether he was accustomed to it or not. In the end I sat with him under the pharmacy's narrow awning for the better part of 20 minutes, out of the worst of the rain, making small, unhurried conversation to keep his mind off the throbbing in his ankle, the kind of conversation you learn to make in a clinic, light enough not to strain anyone, steady enough to be a kind of anchor. I didn't ask him what he did for a living. I want to be honest about that, because it would have been the easiest thing in the world to ask, and something in me simply didn't. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was that his composure, even in visible pain, made the question feel beside the point. Whatever the reason, I never asked, and he never offered, and it would be some time before I understood how unusual that omission actually was for a man like him. A black car pulled up eventually, nothing showy, just a dark, unremarkable sedan, and a man got out from the driver's side with an umbrella already open, moving toward us with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done this exact motion 1,000 times before. He was maybe 50, solidly built, with the kind of watchful, economical bearing I'd later come to associate with people whose entire job is paying attention on someone else's behalf. "Mr. Ashcombe," he said, crouching immediately to assess the ankle himself, and there was real alarm under his professional calm. "What happened?" "A curb happened, Desmond." Nothing more dramatic than that. Bartholomew's voice had gone lighter, almost teasing, the voice of a man reassuring someone he cared about more than he was letting on. This young woman happened to be the more useful thing that occurred tonight. Noelle Ferris. She's a physical therapist, and she wouldn't let me stand until she'd confirmed I wasn't about to make a fool of myself trying. The driver, Desmond, I'd learned his name was Desmond Whitlock, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time, something between gratitude and a kind of careful reassessment, like he was updating a file in his head. "Thank you," he said, simply, and I remember thinking it was an oddly formal thank you for a stranger helping another stranger on a rainy sidewalk, weighted with more than the moment seemed to call for. Between the two of us we got Bartholomew into the back seat of the car. He tried, once more, to offer me something, cab fare, he said, though it felt like a stand-in for something he wasn't sure how to phrase, and I waved it off the way I would have waved off anyone. "Get the ankle looked at tonight," I told him through the open door. "And ice it, not heat, for the first 48 hours, no matter what anyone tells you otherwise." "Duly noted, Dr. Ferris." "I'm not a doctor. Physical therapist." "My mistake," he said, and there was something warm in it, something almost amused, and then Desmond Whitlock shut the door gently, gave me one more long look I didn't fully understand, and the car pulled away into the rain, and that, I assumed, was the entire story. A kindness done, a stranger helped, an evening that would make a decent anecdote and nothing more. I want you to understand how genuinely I believed that, walking home soaked through with my useless bag of pharmacy items, because it makes everything that came after feel stranger in hindsight than it had any right to feel at the time. "Get the ankle looked at tonight," I told him through the open door. "And ice it, not heat, for the first 48 hours, no matter what anyone tells you otherwise." "Duly noted, Dr. Ferris." "I'm not a doctor. Physical therapist." "My mistake," he said, and there was something warm in it, something almost amused, and then Desmond Whitlock shut the door gently, gave me one more long look I didn't fully understand, and the car pulled away into the rain, and that, I assumed, was the entire story. A kindness done, a stranger helped, an evening that would make a decent anecdote and nothing more. I want you to understand how genuinely I believed that, walking home soaked through with my useless bag of pharmacy items, because it makes everything that came after feel stranger in hindsight than it had any right to feel at the time. The days right after that evening were, in every ordinary way, exactly like the days before it. I went to work, I saw my patients, I came home tired the way physical therapists always come home tired, my hands sore from hours of careful, repetitive pressure against other people's stiffness and pain. I remember mentioning the man on the curb to my mother on our Sunday phone call, almost as an afterthought, the way you'd mention any small strange thing that happened during your week. "You just knelt down next to a stranger in the rain?" she asked, half amused, half exasperated in the specific way mothers are exasperated by their children's instincts toward strangers. "Somebody had to," I told her. "Everyone else was walking past him." I should explain something about Bartholomew Ashcombe that I didn't understand that night on Delacroix Street and only came to understand slowly. Over the weeks that followed, he was, by most accounts, an intensely private man, protective of his time and his identity in a way that went beyond ordinary caution. Desmond told me, sitting in the clinic's small break room over coffee that afternoon, that Bartholomew had spent nearly 4 decades building his company from almost nothing, and that somewhere in the middle of that climb, he developed a deep discomfort with being recognized, not out of arrogance, Desmond was careful to specify, but the opposite. He didn't trust kindness that arrived once people knew who he was. He'd been fooled by it too many times, courted by people whose warmth evaporated the instant they learned he had nothing left to offer them. That's why he doesn't carry identification when he walks in the evenings, Desmond said. No wallet with his name in it, nothing on his person that would tell a passerby who he is. He wants to know, every so often, what the world actually does with him when there's no reason to be kind except kindness itself. He paused, turning his cup slowly. In 30 years of driving that man, Miss Ferris, I have watched a great many people walk straight past him on a sidewalk. You didn't. He hasn't stopped talking about it. I didn't know what to say to that, not right away. It felt strange to hear that an ordinary evening, an evening I'd genuinely forgotten within 2 weeks, had apparently lodged itself in someone else's memory as something significant. I told Desmond, honestly, that I hadn't done anything special, that I would have knelt down beside anyone in that condition, that it wasn't an act of particular virtue so much as simple professional instinct. I believe you, Desmond said. That's rather the point. He's had a great deal of help offered to him over the years by people who knew exactly who he was and calculated exactly what it might be worth to help him. You offered help to a stranger with a bad ankle, at an hour when nobody was watching, and expected nothing back. He would like the chance to properly thank you for that, if you'll allow him to. I went to see him the following week, at his request, at an address that turned out to be nothing like what I'd braced myself for, not a mansion, not a penthouse, but a modest brick townhouse on a quiet street, the kind of place that could have belonged to any moderately comfortable professional in the city, unremarkable in every way except for the discreet security presence I noticed only because I was looking for it. He answered the door himself, moving carefully on a walking boot, and waved off my instinct to help him to a chair. I've been told, in no uncertain terms, that I'm meant to be resting this, he said, gesturing at the boot, and I've been largely compliant, which my staff assures me is a minor miracle. He gestured me toward a small sitting room, comfortable rather than grand, books stacked in the particular disorder of someone who actually reads them rather than displays them. Thank you for coming. And thank you, more than I managed to say properly on the sidewalk, for that evening. You don't need to thank me, I said. Anyone would have. They wouldn't have, he said, not unkindly, but firmly, the same firmness I remembered from the sidewalk when he'd tried, uselessly, to insist he didn't need help. I understand that from where you're standing it feels like an ordinary decency, the kind of thing you'd expect from anyone. I promise you, Miss Ferris, it is considerably rarer than you think, and I've had 4 decades of evidence to draw the comparison from. He told me, then, more of what Desmond had already begun to explain, about the quiet, careful evenings he sometimes took without any identification, without the car following too closely, just to remember what it felt like to move through the world as an ordinary person rather than a name attached to a company. He told me it had become, over the years, less an experiment and more a kind of private ritual, a way of checking whether the part of the city he'd helped build still had any unbought kindness left in it. Most evenings, he admitted, I learn very little. People are busy. They have their own lives to attend to, their own reign to walk through, and I don't fault them for it. I've walked past plenty of people myself over the years, before I understood what that habit was costing me to carry. But every so often, an evening like the one on Delacroix Street happens, and it recalibrates something in me that I think would otherwise have gone quietly hard with age. He told me, then, more of what Desmond had already begun to explain, about the quiet, careful evenings he sometimes took without any identification, without the car following too closely, just to remember what it felt like to move through the world as an ordinary person rather than a name attached to a company. He told me it had become, over the years, less an experiment and more a kind of private ritual, a way of checking whether the part of the city he'd helped build still had any unbought kindness left in it. Most evenings, he admitted, I learn very little. People are busy. They have their own lives to attend to, their own reign to walk through, and I don't fault them for it. I've walked past plenty of people myself over the years, before I understood what that habit was costing me to carry. But every so often, an evening like the one on Delacroix Street happens, and it recalibrates something in me that I think would otherwise have gone quietly hard with age. I asked him whether Desmond knew, every time, when he was heading out on one of those evenings, or whether even that small habit of caution was something he sometimes abandoned. Desmond always knows, he said, with something like fond exasperation. I've tried, on occasion, to leave without telling him. It has never once worked. He has an unsettling talent for materializing exactly when I least expect him, at a discreet enough distance not to interfere, close enough to intervene the moment something actually goes wrong. I used to find it intrusive. These days I find it something closer to comforting, though I'd deny that if he were in the room. A small, wry smile. He's been with me for 31 years, Miss Ferris. I trust very few people the way I trust that man, and I've told him so exactly once, which he still brings up whenever he wants to win an argument. I asked him, too, what exactly he'd expected to happen that evening, before I'd knelt down beside him, whether he'd anticipated that someone would eventually stop, or whether the entire habit had, by then, become more about the walking itself than about any real hope of what he might find at the end of it. Honestly, he said, I'd stopped expecting very much of anything. I want to be clear that isn't self-pity. I have, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinarily fortunate life. But there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being unable to fully trust why anyone is kind to you, and after enough years of it, you begin to brace yourself against disappointment as a matter of habit, the same way you'd brace against an expected fall. I wasn't expecting to be disappointed that evening, on the sidewalk. I simply wasn't expecting anything at all. That, I think, is precisely why it mattered as much as it did. I didn't know, sitting in that sitting room, what to do with the strange, sudden intimacy of being told something that honest by a man I'd known for less than an hour of actual conversation. I asked him, carefully, why it mattered so much to him, a single evening, a single stranger, in a life that must have been full of people trying to earn his attention by more calculated means. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. Because I built a company by trusting almost no one who approached me without knowing they'd get something back, he said. It made me successful. It also made me, I think, a harder man than I set out to become. My late wife used to tell me that the measure of a person isn't what they do when they're being watched, it's what they do on a wet sidewalk when they think no one who matters will ever hear about it. His eyes went distant for a moment, some private grief crossing his face and then folding itself carefully away, the way I imagined he'd learned to fold a great many things away over the years. She's been gone 11 years now. I don't often get the chance, these days, to tell her she was right about something. That evening, I found I very much wanted to. I understood then that this wasn't really about the sprained ankle at all, or even entirely about me. It was about a promise he'd made, in some private way, to a woman he'd lost, and a single ordinary evening that had let him keep it, unexpectedly, years after he'd stopped believing he'd get the chance. What came after that conversation wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect from a story like this, no dramatic reversal of fortune, no sudden windfall handed to me in gratitude. Bartholomew Ashcombe, I came to learn, didn't operate that way, and I think I would have refused it if he had. It would have cheapened something that had mattered precisely because it wasn't transactional. What he offered instead, some months later, was smaller and, I think, more lasting, funding, through Ashcombe Meridian's philanthropic arm, for a pro bono rehabilitation program at the clinic where I worked, aimed specifically at patients who'd been injured in circumstances much like his own that evening, falls, sudden accidents, people without the means to pay for the kind of careful, unhurried care that makes the real difference in recovery. He asked me to help design it. Not because I'd knelt beside him on a sidewalk, he told me plainly, echoing something Desmond had said to me weeks earlier, but because I'd shown him, in 20 minutes under a pharmacy awning, exactly the kind of unhurried, professional care he wanted the program to be built around. The clinic's director, a careful, soft-spoken man named Franklin Osei who'd run the place for nearly 2 decades, called me into his office the week the funding was formally approved, looking somewhere between delighted and faintly bewildered. In 20 years running this clinic, he told me, I have written more grant applications than I care to count, most of which went nowhere, and here you've brought us a fully funded rehabilitation program because you helped a man off a sidewalk. He shook his head, not unkindly. I don't know what to make of that, Noel, except that I'm very glad it was you who happened to be walking down Delacroix Street that evening. We spent the better part of 2 months building the program together, Bartholomew insisting, over Franklin's mild objections, that his name stay off the signage entirely, that it be listed simply as a community rehabilitation initiative rather than anything bearing the Ashcombe Meridian name. When I asked him why, given that most philanthropic funding of that scale usually came with a building named after the person who'd written the check, he gave me a look that reminded me, briefly, of the sharp, appraising look he'd given me on the sidewalk that first night. Because the moment my name is on the door, he said, it stops being a program for people who need care and starts being a program people believe they owe me something for receiving. I've spent a great deal of my life being thanked by people who felt obligated to thank me. I'd rather, just this once, build something where no one feels that obligation at all. The program's first patients arrived in early spring, a delivery driver with a shattered wrist from an icy sidewalk fall much like Bartholomew's own, a retired schoolteacher recovering from a hip replacement she couldn't otherwise have afforded proper rehabilitation for, a teenager injured in a bicycle accident whose family had been quietly skipping his physical therapy appointments because the copays had become impossible to sustain. I worked with several of them myself, in the early months, and there was something quietly moving about watching people move a little more freely each week, knowing the reason they'd gotten the chance at all traced back to a single wet Tuesday evening that had, at the time, felt like nothing more than an ordinary errand interrupted. Rosalind, when I told her, just shook her head slowly. I told you that man was somebody, she said. I didn't tell you he'd end up funding half our department. You also didn't tell me any of this would happen because I told a stranger to ice his ankle instead of heating it, I said, and she laughed, and it became, between the two of us, something like a private joke. The entire strange chain of consequence that had unfolded from one small, correct piece of medical advice given to a man I hadn't recognized. I still see Bartholomew occasionally, months later, mostly at the clinic when he stops by to check on the program's progress, moving now without the boot, without any lasting damage from that evening beyond, I think, a permanent fondness for the pharmacy awning where a stranger once refused to let him stand up too soon. Desmond still drives him, still watches over him with that same careful, economical attention, though he greets me now, when I see him, with something closer to warmth than the formal gratitude of that first rainy night. I think about that Tuesday often, how close I came to walking past like everyone else, head down against the rain, errand bag swinging at my side, how little separated the version of that evening where I noticed him from the version where I didn't. I don't say that to claim any particular virtue for myself. I say it because I think it's true of almost everyone, almost every day, that the difference between an ordinary evening and a night someone else remembers for the rest of their life is very often nothing more than the decision to actually look. I think about that Tuesday often, how close I came to walking past like everyone else, head down against the rain, errand bag swinging at my side, how little separated the version of that evening where I noticed him from the version where I didn't. I don't say that to claim any particular virtue for myself. I say it because I think it's true of almost everyone, almost every day, that the difference between an ordinary evening and a night someone else remembers for the rest of their life is very often nothing more than the decision to actually look. I think, too, about what my mother said on that Sunday call, before any of this had unfolded, before I had any idea that the man on the curb was anyone other than an unlucky stranger. That noticing when a body is in trouble and moving toward it rather than away is simply a habit some people are given, or grow into, or choose, one small decision at a time, until it stops being a decision at all and becomes something closer to instinct. I don't know that I did anything on Delacroix Street that required particular courage or particular virtue. I knelt down because kneeling down was the thing my training and, I think, my mother's example had made automatic in me long before I understood what that automatic response might eventually cost or give me. He told me once, near the end of that first long conversation in his sitting room, that he didn't believe kindness needed to be rare to matter, only that it needed to be real, offered without calculation, to someone who couldn't do anything for you in return. I've thought about that more than almost anything else he said to me. I think, in the end, that's the whole of what this story is really about, Not a chauffeur showing up looking for the woman who'd helped his employer, not a company, not a program with a philanthropic budget attached to it, but the plain, unglamorous fact that a man fell on a curb in the rain, and a stranger knelt down beside him, and neither of them knew, in that moment, that it would turn out to matter to either one of them nearly as much as it did. If this story stayed with you, I'd love for you to like it and subscribe for more true, quiet stories about the strangers who turn out to be watching us right back.